Okay, this will be a follow-up video to my recent video about Erika Kirk, the former Florida First Lady, and this will be focused more on her husband Claude Kirk. He was governor of Florida from 1967 to 1971, and there was just so much crazy stuff that went on during his tenure as governor. He was honestly probably just the wildest governor of all time. He was this really flamboyant, over-the-top type politician, just a really fascinating guy. But before I get into Claude Kirk, I wanted to share something odd about Erika Kirk, sort of an update to the video that I just did. So if you didn't see that video, it's just the weirdest thing. Everybody knows Erika Kirk, Charlie Kirk's wife, who's been everywhere in the news recently. And the really odd thing is that the Florida First Lady back in the 1960s, who was married to Claude Kirk, who I'll talk about in a second, she was also named Erika Kirk. And she looks absolutely identical to the modern Erika Kirk. And this 1960s Erika Kirk was this real enigma because after Claude Kirk was named governor, he showed up to his inauguration ball with this mystery girl, and no one knew who she was or had ever seen her with him before. And he'd introduce her to everyone as Madam X. And there was all this mystery about her. It was discovered that she was from Germany and she'd immigrated to South America and she'd met Claude Kirk in South America. Then he became governor and she became First Lady of Florida. And it's very commonly known that a lot of Nazis immigrated to South America after World War II. There was this Camp Colonial Dignidad, which was filled with German immigrants. I get into all of that in the first video, and there were a ton of good comments on that video. A lot of people pointed out that Erica with a K is not a common way of spelling Erica. Spelling Erica with a C is much more traditional, so it's very odd that these two women, 50 years apart, not only look identical and have the same name, but also spell it in the same way. And very interestingly, the most popular marching song for Nazi Germany during World War II was named Erika with a K. So I thought that was real interesting how this 1960s Erika Kirk went from Germany to South America to the First Lady of Florida. And there was this Nazi marching song named Erika with a K. I mentioned this in the previous video, but I think this was a human cloning thing where these people, these two Erika Kirks, were created from the same DNA. The Nazis were very big into genetic experimentation. There's all sorts of genetic experiments that went on in Colonial Dignidad. And I actually did a video on human cloning very recently and talked about how it's really not a far-fetched concept at all. It's something that was talked about 50 plus years ago. Human cloning is definitely not as futuristic or far out there as some people might think. And I thought this was just kind of a interesting little side note to the Erika Kirk mystery that I talked about in that first video, that there's this Nazi marching song named Erika with a K. Anyway, this video will be focused more on her husband Claude Kirk, who was the governor of Florida from 1967 to 1971, and he is just a fascinating guy. He's probably the most fascinating governor in the history of the United States. There was just so much important, just crazy stuff that went on during his time as governor. He was known as being just totally outlandish. He's always described as really flamboyant and outspoken, always doing these wild publicity stunts. Here he is holding up a skinned chicken at a press conference, and this New York Times feature on him describes him as a dizzying experience and the most bizarre happening in Florida's political history. And there's all these stories about the wild things he would do for publicity. He participated with police in a raid on a motorcycle gang hangout, and he scuba dived and planted the Florida flag on the bottom of the ocean. And he was nicknamed Claudius Maximus and King Claude because he was just such a larger than life type guy. He was constantly getting in public arguments with other politicians. Some of them loved him, some of them absolutely hated his guts. And he has this quote here that just kind of summarizes his time as governor. He says, "The garden of controversy must be continually cultivated, otherwise, nobody knows you're alive." And he wasn't some like clown or joke of a guy. He was thought of very, very highly. And he was even mentioned repeatedly as someone who could become vice president or even president of the United States. He was really thought of that highly. And there's a big kind of mystery surrounding him because the story of him and how he became governor is pretty suspicious. So he was in the military and then he went to law school and he worked a few assorted jobs. Then he became president of an insurance company and served as president for 5 years. and made all this money. Then he abruptly quit and started up an investment firm that had offices in Jacksonville, Brazil, and Ireland. And it was said that Claude Kirk spent just a ton of time in Brazil as part of this investment firm. And the details of what exactly this investment firm, quote unquote, was and what exactly Claude Kirk was doing in South America this whole time, they're like really murky. He was questioned a lot about this investment firm when he ran for governor a few years down the road, and he never really gave a straight answer. And honestly, this is a massive red flag that he had this business with offices in Florida, South America, and Ireland. It kind of seems like three just random locations, but these three locations are very big hotspots for drug trafficking. And it really seems like this quote unquote investment firm was a front for drug trafficking. Obviously, there's always been a ton of drugs from South America to Florida, and actually, Ireland is a major drug importing location. There are just a ton of articles out there about drug trafficking in Ireland. This John DeLorean case, which is probably the most famous drug trafficking case of all time. The owner of the DeLorean car company was busted for being involved in a drug trafficking ring. And this John DeLorean, his company was based in Ireland. He was an American, he was a Detroit guy. So it kind of made no sense that he would have the headquarters for his DeLorean car company all the way in Ireland. But then when he got busted for drug trafficking, it started to make a little more sense. So it is super suspicious that Claude Kirk had this mysterious business, this, investment company that just happened to have offices in these three random locations that just happened to be major drug trafficking locations. And then after this, Claude Kirk just kind of randomly got involved in politics. He ran for Senate in the early 1960s and he lost. Then he ran for governor of Florida in 1966 and he won with no political experience at all. So, zero political experience. And by far the strangest thing that happened during his election was the inauguration ball, because Claude Kirk was single at the time. He was actually called the most eligible bachelor in Florida when he was elected. And he showed up to his inauguration ball with this mysterious girl, and he just referred to her as Madam X. And this was the mysterious Erika Kirk. Her name was Erika Matfeld at the time, and she's the one who had immigrated from Germany to South America. And then right after Claude Kirk was elected, he announced that he was marrying her just a few days after this inauguration ball. And Erika Kirk just turned into this total celebrity in Florida. She was constantly talked about and featured in the news. And Florida was just really insane during Claude Kirk's time as governor. There was so much interesting stuff going on. And first off, the Apollo 11 moon landing happened, the first moon landing, and this Apollo mission took off from Cape Canaveral in Florida. Here's Erika Kirk crying during the launch. Her and Claude Kirk attended the launch. Obviously, there are just a ton of questions about the moon landing and whether it was faked. And there's just a whole big controversy surrounding these moon trips. And it's interesting that Claude Kirk was governor when this trip took off from Florida. And he was also governor of Florida when Disney World was built. And he was the one who signed into law the Reedy Creek Development Act. And this is known as the Disney Bill, quote unquote, because it was signed right before Disney World was built in Florida. And what this bill did was it turned the area that Disney World sits on into its own self-governed district ran by Disney. It basically turned it into its own city that Disney ran and owned. And Claude Kirk was the one who signed this into law. And the reason I find this really, really interesting has to do with Epcot. So most people know Epcot as this big silver ball, but Epcot is really fascinating because it was originally envisioned by Walt Disney as a city with 20,000 permanent residents. And Epcot actually stands for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. And this is what Walt Disney envisioned the original Epcot city looking like. So it was way more initially than just some big silver ball. He envisioned 20,000 people living in this city. And really, what Epcot City was initially was basically the first 15-minute city. If you read about what the plans for Epcot were, it is literally identical to these 15-minute cities that are always in the news today. It's a big controversial issue. There's all these articles about the 15-minute cities. A lot of people oppose them because they think it's like a New World Order type thing where the government would have total surveillance and total control of the people who live in these 15-minute cities. And literally, this is exactly what Epcot City was originally envisioned as. It was going to be a city with 20,000 people where the city just had all this control over the people who lived there. As you can see in this first highlight here, it says no one living in Epcot would own their own land or home, so no one would have municipal voting rights. So you wouldn't own anything, it would all be owned by Disney, and you wouldn't have voting rights on local issues. And this second highlight here says all adults living in Epcot would be employed, thereby preventing the formation of slums and ghettos. Everyone would be required to have a job. And the plan was for all these people living in Epcot to all work at Disney World just a short distance away so they wouldn't need cars. And it was said this Epcot planned community was basically Walt Disney's dream. And then he died shortly before work began on Disney World. And when he died, the plan for Epcot died as well. But it's really interesting that Claude Kirk is the one who signed this Reedy Creek Development Act into law that let Disney form this city and gave them all this power within the city. And had Walt Disney not passed away, these plans to build this Epcot city, they would have happened. And Disney World being built during Claude Kirk's tenure as Florida governor is interesting because there's a lot of weird stuff with Disney World. There's this secretive Club 33. 33 is a Masonic number. The 33rd degree is the highest level of Freemasonry. And Roy Disney, who took over the construction of Disney World after Walt Disney died, Roy Disney was a 33rd degree Freemason. There's also this just massive network of underground tunnels underneath Disney World. There's always been rumors that a lot of bad stuff is transported and a lot of bad stuff goes down within these tunnels. But I did just kind of find it interesting that Claude Kirk is the governor who basically made Disney World happen. And another really suspicious guy that Claude Kirk was majorly connected to was this guy, George Wackenhut. And George Wackenhut ran a company named Wackenhut. And this is some real, like, New World Order type stuff. So, Wackenhut, the company, was described as a private security company for hospitals, prisons, and government installations. And it was compared to like a modern day version of OCP in the RoboCop movies, if you've ever seen those movies. But Wackenhut was way more than that. So first of all, it was an absolutely massive company, $600 million a year at one point. And what they really specialized in was surveillance, not security. And Wackenhut themselves claimed that they had a file on 2.5 million different Americans at one point, which was one in every 46 Americans at the time. And Wackenhut was majorly connected to the FBI and the CIA. The company's reputation was basically that they were the ones you went to when you had to get something done that you couldn't officially be involved in yourself. And their board of directors was just a ton of former FBI and CIA directors. As this quote at the bottom there says from a retired FBI agent, he says, "It is well known throughout the industry that if you want a dirty job done, call Wackenhut." So, what does this have to do with Claude Kirk? Because right after he was elected governor, Claude Kirk hired Wackenhut to be a private police force for the state of Florida. And this was a totally private police force that was funded by outside contributions, so it wasn't state funded. And they were referred to as Wacken Cops. And basically, this was just a big group of Wackenhut employees who were given the power to conduct criminal investigations in the state of Florida by Claude Kirk. And again, this is just some really New World Order type stuff for a state to give a private company like Wackenhut basically free reign to gather information on their state citizens and investigate and spy on their state citizens. It was explained away as, Florida's cracking down on crime and they're using Wackenhut to crack down on crime and take down a bunch of criminals. But this Wackenhut organization, I mean, they were definitely involved in just a lot of really shady stuff. So you do have to wonder what all they were up to. And also, right after he was inaugurated, Claude Kirk and Erika went on a vacation and they sailed around the ocean for a few days. And this was aboard George Wackenhut's yacht. So, George Wackenhut and Claude Kirk were definitely in tight with each other. And just as a little side note, George Wackenhut's yacht is named Security Risk, which is just one of the greatest names for a yacht I've ever heard. Just an absolutely phenomenal name for a yacht. But anyway, the whole Wackenhut being used by the state of Florida to investigate people, it was really heavily criticized by citizens, and there were a lot of police departments who just refused to work with these Wacken cops. And there was just a ton of criticism, and after about a year, the program was dissolved. So it didn't last long. But between Epcot being like basically the original 15-minute city and Claude Kirk signing the legislation that enabled that, and Claude Kirk giving this private company Wackenhut just a ton of power to investigate people within the state, it really seems like Claude Kirk was being used to like test run or usher in like a new world order type agenda of like surveillance and control. And this was all the way back like 60 years ago. And Claude Kirk was a very close ally of Nelson Rockefeller. Claude Kirk was long mentioned as being Nelson Rockefeller's vice president if Rockefeller was ever elected president, and Rockefeller did come close a number of times. And the Rockefellers have always been mentioned as really big proponents and almost like the ones behind instituting a New World Order type control over people and over society. Now, obviously, for Claude Kirk to get elected Florida governor with zero political experience, he would have needed some serious power and some serious money behind him. You can't just go from being a nobody to getting elected as governor of a state like Florida without something like that. So it really seems like he was in tight with the Rockefellers. They helped him get elected. And then he started to do almost like a test run of this New World Order control that they were big proponents of. And lastly, just wanted to mention a final thing. So, as I mentioned, the 1960s Erika Kirk, she has a really curious background. She grew up in Germany, then went to Brazil. A whole bunch of Nazis did the same thing after World War II. And one thing that's talked about a lot is how a lot of these Nazi scientists were just huge into studying eugenics. They had a long history of studying identical twins and experimenting on them. And a lot of people think these identical twin experiments they were performing were actually early human cloning experiments, creating replicas of people using that person's DNA. Joseph Mengele, in particular, is a very infamous Nazi scientist who did a lot of studies and experiments with identical twins. And he fled to Argentina and then ended up in Brazil after World War II. And there's actually a town in Brazil, this town, Candido Godoy, that's referred to as Twin Town because there's just a ridiculously high number of identical twins who live there. And it's even been speculated that this was like the byproduct of some sort of Nazi twinning or cloning experiment. And that's why there are so many identical twins who live in this town. But one thing I did find very curious is that Claude Kirk had 4 kids with his first wife, and 2 of them were identical twins, Frank and Will Kirk. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and it could definitely tie in with this whole idea of these two Erika Kirks being clones of one another, being born in like a test tube or a lab, using the same DNA. It's really not that far-fetched of an idea or as out there as some people might think it is. You can watch that History of Human Cloning video I did if you want to learn more and see how, I mean, human cloning has just been talked about for a very, very long time. So that's a quick little follow up to my previous Erika Kirk video. Obviously, this whole story is just insanely strange and very, very intriguing on a number of levels. Thanks so much for the great comments in the first video. There were just so many really good comments on that first Erika Kirk video. So I really appreciate that. And then lastly, thank you so much. Big shout out to the supporters here on YouTube and on Patreon. Truly appreciate your support. It really means a lot. So I greatly appreciate that. Thanks so much again, and we'll see you soon with another video.